Hello, my name is Russ Whitehead, and I'm here today to talk about securing the HPCC Systems landing zone and the exciting new security features that have been added to the HPCC Systems 9.x series. First, I would like to explain what a landing zone is and its purpose for an HPCC Systems cluster. I will show a short demo that highlights how an administrator can configure several landing zones and how to view those landing zones in ECL Watch. From here, I'm going to discuss the legacy security features that are in use today to protect a landing zone. I will demonstrate with another short video how to create role-based HPCC groups and how to use these role-based groups to grant legacy landing zone access. Next, I'll be discussing the limitations of these legacy landing zone authorization methods and how the platform team responded with the new landing zone scope feature. Finally, I will show a video demonstration of modifying these existing role-based groups to enable this new landing zone scopes feature in order to fine-tune the access granularity of the landing zone. So first, I would like to address what is an HPCC Systems landing zone. You may see in the documentation and in ECL Watch, it's referred to as a landing zone or sometimes as a drop zone. These two terms are used interchangeably and collectively describe a set of file system folders and subfolders that are used to move data in and out of an HPCC Systems cluster. You can upload files to a landing zone, and from there, you can spray the landing zone contents onto an HPC Systems distributed file system cluster. You can despray this distributed file back to your landing zone and download it to your favorite file system location. Currently, these features are controlled via LDAP secured feature level authorization, which I'm going to discuss shortly. But first, I want to talk about the types of methods you can use to access a landing zone. First, you can list and search landing zone files and metadata, much like a directory listing of your local PC. You can upload a file to a landing zone from your file system or some other remote location. You can read and write the contents of files on a landing zone. You can spray a file from the landing zone to a distributed file on an HPCC cluster. You can despray the file back to your landing zone and then finally download it to your favorite file system location. So I discussed the legacy feature level permissions, and now I want to explain in more detail what those are. Their purpose relates to a landing zone is to secure access to the landing zone. A feature level permission in general is a named service that is stored in an active directory database, also known as LDAP. Each of these features has permissions assigned to it, also stored in LDAP. Now, the ESP services check these named features before they let you access and execute features within their services. As an example, there's one called Own Work Unit Access, and WS Work Units will check that you have proper permissions to the Own Work Units Access feature before you can execute your own work units. If you try to execute someone else's work units, it checks a different feature called Other Work Units Access to ensure that you're authenticated and authorized to do such an activity. As feature level authorization relates to landing zones, there are 4 different named features. And as you can see in this chart, I'm describing the various landing zone activities which we've discussed and which features are checked to ensure that you're authorized to perform these activities. You'll notice that some of them are used for multiple things. For instance, file I/O access, that's used to read and write contents. You need different sets of permissions to do different operations. Obviously, to read the contents of a landing zone file, you need read access. To write contents to a landing zone, you need a greater level of write access, which includes read. So the next thing I want to discuss is how an HPCC administrator can configure the system to include one or more landing zones in the configuration file. Bare metal implementations use an environment.xml file, which is managed with a config manager tool, or you can hand edit Helm charts and Terraform for containerized deployments. It's recommended that your landing zone scopes use separate file folders for each logical grouping, and recommend that you use meaningful scope naming conventions to help your administrators manage the different roles. And obviously, a clearly defined file system hierarchy is important to help you organize and manage the data. So once the administrator has configured these landing zones, he will deploy the configuration file to the cluster. As an aside, you need to make sure that LDAP Security Manager is enabled for both DALI and ESP. This is where the management of these named features are kept and stored and retrieved, and it has to be enabled for both DALI and ESP. Finally, the administrator will start the secured HPCC cluster, and you'll be able to see these features you've just added.
Here I want to demonstrate how to modify the HPCC Systems configuration to add 2 new landing zones. We will be making these modifications on a bare metal deployment using the Config Manager tool and modifying the default environment.xml file. We will then deploy the modified configuration file and restart the HPCC cluster so that our environment changes take effect. Then we will use the ECL Watch browser interface to view these landing zones to ensure that they meet our expectations. The first thing you need to do is ensure that the Configuration Manager service is running, which defaults to port 8015. Navigate our browser to that location and open the default environment.xml file. You do this by selecting Advanced View, where you can open an existing file. We're choosing the environment file. And always remember to select write access. I seem to have trouble with this, but I got it this time. The first thing you want to do is add the hardware, which is going to be the IP locations where your landing zones exist. In the Computers tab, to do this, you right-click, New, and you type in a unique name for your landing zone and the IP address. Now, I'm going to do everything locally, so I've already added localhost, and it binds to the local net address of dot. The next thing you're going to do is find drop zone. By default, you get one drop zone, and you'll see that that drop zone has a name, my drop zone, and it's the physical mounted file location is going to be under varlib HPCC Systems my drop zone. And if you look at the server list, it's going to show you that it is bound to the local host itself. So right-click, select New Component, Drop Zone. You're creating a new drop zone. So the first thing you want to do is give it a unique name. Let's call this DZ Insurance. And the directory where we want this to go, let's put it underneath the existing drop zone. Make sure everything looks good. Go to the server list and bind it to the local host. Look again to make sure I save periodically. Now we're going to add another one. You can either create a new one like we just did that one, or I find the easiest way to do it is to just right click on the existing one, duplicate it, gives it the suffix of 2, and let's give it its own unique name. Let's call this drop zone motor vehicles, and we will place those files in the file location DZ motor vehicles. And since we copied it from the previous one, the server list should already be populated, but let's go back and double check. There it is, the local host. And save your configuration. So there you have it. You've created 2 new drop zones. The next thing to do is to deploy the configuration file, start your HPCC cluster, and then go into ECL Watch to view that what you've done is reflected correctly. So I've already done this, and here we have the ECL Watch. What you want to do is go into the navigation pane of ECL Watch 9. I don't know why they call it a pane, because I find it very easy to use, but you'll select the Files option. And from these options here, you'll choose Landing Zones. And what you see here is my drop zone, which is the one we got for free, and the 2 that we created by name, DZ Insurance, DZ Motor Vehicles. And note that it also shows you the location on the file system where those files will be located. You can expand these and see that this binds to the local host, or if you choose to bind it to a different IP, it would show the name of that. And from here, you can select a particular landing zone and do operations like upload a file from your file system to the landing zone. But once it's uploaded, then you can spray it to a distributed logical file on the cluster. You can despray from the cluster back to your landing zone. From there, you can copy it back to your local file system and do whatever you want. So there you have it. We've created 2 landing zones.
Okay, so that was obviously using the Configuration Manager tool to modify a bare metal environment file. I just wanted to show you here how you can hand edit a Helm chart for a containerized deployment to add 1 or more landing zones. Within the storage planes section of the chart, at the bottom you'll see what was added is the category LZ identifies this as a landing zone. It's given a unique name, my drop zone, which we've seen before. And finally, the prefix is the file system location for the drop zone, where files will be copied to, copied from, and so forth. And you can have you can actually have 0 or more landing zones in this part of the Helm chart. The next thing I want to discuss is how to grant role-based access to HPCC systems groups. Basically, at a high level, you're going to create an HPCC LDAP group for each user role. I recommend you use a meaningful name for each role, something like I've suggested: landing zone users, work unit executors, topology managers, and so forth. For each one of those groups, you'll define the permissions that apply to those roles. And finally, you'll add the appropriate users to those role-based groups. Now, what's good about this is that it simplifies your role management of users once it's configured. It is quite a bit more work, but a lot more secure than what I think is the current method of just creating a single group, call it ECL users, and granting every single permission, full access, and adding every single valid user to that group. And I want to point out that this role-based pattern works for any HPCC role, not just landing zones.
Here, I want to demonstrate how to create role-based LDAP groups for member users to be able to access and perform operations on the configured HPCC Systems landing zones. These landing zone operations include features such as uploading and downloading files to and from a landing zone, spraying and despraying files to and from a landing zone. Note that this is using the legacy security features that have always been in place using feature level permissions. The first thing we're going to do is create an LDAP Active Directory group for each configured landing zone. We will then grant permissions to each group access to the landing zone to do operations such as uploading and downloading files, as I said, using the legacy security feature level permissions. Finally, we will add authorized users to each group, allowing them to access the landing zone and perform authorized landing zone operations. In ECL Watch, we will navigate to the security features screen as before. Remember that you have to be an HPCC administrator to be able to access this screen. To be an administrator, you need to be a member of the HPCC administrators group. So in the navigation pane on the left, select Operations, Security. And here you have three different tabs related to security. The first one allows you to manage users. You can add users, delete users, modify an existing user, filter to a specific user if you have hundreds or thousands of them available, and export to a CSV. I've already created a couple users we're going to use for this demonstration, Barbara and Bob. In the Groups tab, this shows the existing LDAP groups, which we're going to use to add permissions for the landing zone. Here, again, you can add users, add groups, delete groups, open existing ones to modify it, and export to a CSV file. Finally, you have the Permissions tab, where you can view and modify permissions related to various ESP features. Of interest is the ESP features for SMC, which is where you'll find the legacy features for landing zone access. So the first thing we want to do is add a group for each of the landing zones. So we select Add and give it a meaningful group name. I'm going to call it LZ Users Insurance. Managed by, this is a cryptic LDAP OU string, which only an administrator will understand. And the description, let's give it something meaningful. Let's call it insurance. And now we have a group for insurance. Let's go ahead and add another one for motor vehicles. And it's highly recommended that you use meaningful names that will sort properly for the administrators to manage. The cryptic managed by LDAP OU. Add the group. So now we have two groups, but they don't have any members or permissions. So let's go ahead and set them up. Let's start with the insurance group. Select that. From here, you can set properties for that group. The first thing I want to do is add a member to that group. As you see, there are no members currently, since it's a brand new group. So let's go ahead and add one. And here you're given a list of all the users that are not already a member of that group. So let's add Barbara. Barbara is now a member. But the group still has no permissions. There's nothing active. So let's go to the available permissions and set the permissions relevant to the landing zone. Again, these are the legacy security features. Grant access to spray, to despray, file IO, and file upload. So now if we go back to available permissions or active permissions, you can see the ones that we've just added. So we have created a group, added a member, and set the permissions. Let's do the same for the motor vehicle group. This time the member will be someone different. Let's add Bob. And again, this new group has no permissions. So we go to the available permissions, ESP features, and grant full access, IO, upload, spray, and despray. And you could separate these groups out. You could have a group that allows users full access and a different group that just allows you maybe to spray but not despray and so forth. In conclusion, we've created a group for each landing zone, added members to it, and set the permissions. With that, authorized users can now access landing zone features authorized by their group membership.
Okay. So, is this enough security? Raise your hand if you think it is. Well, obviously not. The problem here is that these feature level authorizations that we've just demonstrated, it grants access across an entire landing zone. So a user with valid access to one landing zone folder can read, write, delete, and so forth across the entire landing zone. Users with access to a landing zone could therefore maliciously despray or corrupt or steal sensitive logical files. So as should be expected, our users, administrators, and security auditors have requested a tighter form of control. So the platform team's response was to implement landing zone scope level authorization, or landing zone scopes. Jake Smith and Kevin Wang saw the immediate need and jumped on the opportunity by designing and implementing an LDAP Active Directory-based solution. It capitalized on the existing file scope authorization mechanism in ECL Watch because it's pretty much the same thing. What's different from a HPCC file scope is that for a landing zone scope, you precede the string with the word plane, the file system separator, : and your drop zone name. From there, you can specify a folder name, subfolder names, and so forth, as you do with regular file scopes. So what this does is allows you the opportunity to grant or deny role-based access to individual landing zone folders instead of the entire landing zone. The permissions, as I alluded to, are granted and denied the same as file scopes. You have access read, access write, access full, and deny, and so forth. And this feature is now available in your favorite HPCC Systems 9.x release.
Here I want to demonstrate how to employ the latest HPCC Systems 9.x landing zone scopes feature to more tightly control which LDAP groups have access to which landing zone. With this, we can silo our landing zone data based on assigned group roles, allowing only the authorized group members access to data within. With this, we can silo our landing zone data based on assigned group roles, allowing only authorized group members access to data that their group role dictates. First, we will utilize ECL Watch to navigate to the Permissions tab in the Security section. Operations, Security. And here we're going to go to Permissions, because what we're going to do first is create file scopes or landing zone scopes for the various landing zone locations. So let's expand the file scopes. And I've already got a few here, but let's add some new ones. You'll select file scopes because, as we discussed earlier, a landing zone scope is really just a file system location, and it's uniquely identified or differentiated from a regular file scope by the prefix plain. So let's create one. I've already created one for insurance, but let's go ahead and create one for motor vehicles. Let's create one for the route. And add it. So now we've added file scopes, and you can add additional ones. You can further break your landing zone scope down to subfolders if you wanted to. Like, for instance, so what we've done here is created a subfolder underneath the root. You could create multiple of these, and using the group assignments, which I'm going to show you, you can grant different users access to these different subfolders within a landing zone. So best explained with an example. Now you've created these landing zone scopes, but you haven't done anything with them yet. You now have to assign the permissions, which group can access which scopes. So let's go back to the Groups tab and see the two groups that we created previously. If you open up your insurance group, recall that the member, Barbara Jones, was added. And we have already added the legacy named feature level permissions. The problem that we've already discussed is that when you grant these permissions, that user, Barbara, can access anywhere on the landing zone. It's an all or nothing kind of thing. With this new landing zone scope feature, you can restrict it to certain subsets of the data in the landing zone. So if you go to the available group permissions, remember before we used the SMC features to specify the legacy settings, but what we're going to do now is we're going to go to file scopes and pick some of the landing zones. So this group, insurance, I'm going to grant access to everything related to insurance. So now if you go to your active group permissions, you'll see the named features that we added previously and our insurance scopes. Notice that the group members are all granted full access. Now let's go and modify the motor vehicle group. And for this one, we're going to grant permissions to the motor vehicle scopes. So with this, all members of the motor vehicle group can access these motor vehicle scopes, but they cannot access the insurance scopes. So if you look at your active group permissions, there they are. So with this, you have now created role-based Active Directory groups, added members, and made them role-based by granting access to only certain locations within the landing zone.
Okay, is this enough security? Well, not quite. We're getting close. As an example of one of the problems still exist is that an authorized landing zone user could despray or download or so forth and corrupt sensitive data files from another organization's data, a different scope. The platform recommendation for this problem is to employ the existing file scope authorization features to restrict that group to access only their own organization's logical file scopes and no more. So in summary, you should always secure landing zones and other HPCC features using role-based groups. Each landing zone role-based group contains users and various permissions. Feature level permissions, the legacy stuff, gives global access to the landing zone. You can then further break that down with landing zone scope permissions, which limits access to certain folders and subfolders within the landing zone. And then employ file scope permissions to limit user access to only their organization's cluster-based logical files. Couple tips, things I wanted to point out. This is very important. As we move to the cloud, IP addresses should always be considered dynamic. Don't hard code an IP address into your ECL or SOAP call because your code will break. It's better to abstract it using landing zone names or externalize it in some other mechanism. Save yourself a lot of trouble. Also, the way scopes work, both file scopes, landing zone scopes, and work unit scopes, is you should never deny access to a parent scope, because any deny at a higher level will result in a deny in everything below that level. So be careful not to do that. And finally, as we talked about earlier, you have to make sure that the LDAP Security Manager is enabled in both DALI and ESP. So I want to thank you for listening to me today. I wanted to share some contact information for ESP-related questions. Reach out to Kevin Wang. For your LDAP and Active Directory questions, Ken Rowland is your go-to guy. And finally, for DALI, Jake Smith is the man. And now I'd like to open the discussion up to questions.